there is a moment, and most people miss it completely, where an empath decides without a single word that you no longer have access to them, not to their time, not to their energy, not to the version of them that made you feel more alive than anyone else ever had. That decision doesn't arrive with a fight. It doesn't come with a dramatic exit or a tearful confrontation. It arrives quietly in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when they're washing dishes or staring out a window, and something inside them simply stops reaching for you. You won't see it happen. That's what makes it so disorienting. One day they're present, warm, attentive, the kind of person who remembers what you said 3 weeks ago and asks about it. And then slowly they're not. They still reply to your messages. They still show up. But something essential is gone, and you can feel the absence of it even if you can't name it. By the time most people notice, the decision was made months ago. Here is what no one tells you about empaths. They are not fragile. That is the first myth worth destroying. The word empath has been so diluted by pop psychology that most people picture someone who cries at commercials and needs a weekend to recover from a difficult conversation. That's not what an empath is. An empath is someone whose nervous system is wired for extraordinary attunement. They don't just hear what you say, they register what you didn't say. They feel the shift in your energy before you've consciously identified it yourself. They notice when your laugh sounds slightly different, when your silence has a different texture, when your "I'm fine" means the opposite of what those words suggest. This is not a personality quirk. Neuroscience has demonstrated that highly empathic individuals show measurably higher activation in the mirror neuron system, the neural architecture responsible for feeling what others feel as if it were happening to your own body. This means their emotional world is not just more expansive than average, it is more expensive. Every interaction costs something, which is exactly why when an empath finally chooses to disappear from your life, you should understand the full weight of what that means. They didn't do it lightly. They did it after carrying far more than you ever saw them carry. Now here's the contrast that matters. The one most content on this subject gets completely backwards. People assume empaths disappear because they're too sensitive to handle conflict. The truth is the opposite. Empaths are extraordinary at handling conflict. What they cannot handle, what their nervous system eventually refuses to tolerate, is invisible conflict. The kind that never gets named, the kind that exists in the gap between what is said and what is meant. The kind where you do something that wounds them, and instead of a fight, they absorb it. They process it alone at 2 a.m., turning it over in their mind, trying to find the most generous interpretation of your behavior. They will excuse you more times than you deserve to be excused. They will translate your worst moments into the language of your trauma, your stress, your bad day. They are by nature the most loyal people in any room, until they aren't. And the line between those two states is not where most people expect to find it. Let's be specific, because the behaviors that make an empath disappear are rarely the dramatic ones. It is almost never the big betrayal, the explosive argument, the obvious cruelty. It is the accumulation of small moments that each carry the same message, a message their nervous system eventually receives with complete clarity, even when their conscious mind is still trying to argue otherwise. The message is this: your inner world is not welcome here. It starts with the jokes. You say something sharp about their sensitivity, about how they always take things too seriously, and you frame it as humor. When their expression shifts, you double down. I'm just kidding. You know I'm joking, right? And they smile, because what's the alternative? They've already learned that naming the discomfort will be treated as further evidence of the very sensitivity you were mocking. So they file it. They don't forget it. Empaths rarely forget these moments, but they file it and life continues. Then comes the dismissal, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. They tell you something real, something it costs them courage to say out loud. I've been feeling disconnected from us lately. Or, When you said that yesterday, it stayed with me. And your response, not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort, is to minimize. You're overthinking it. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Why do you always make everything such a big deal? What you just did in that moment is not correct them. You erased them. You told them that their perception of their own emotional experience is wrong. And for someone whose entire way of moving through the world is built on the accuracy of their perception, that erasure lands somewhere much deeper than an argument. It lands in the foundation. Then the reversal happens. They finally name something important. They sit across from you and say, clearly, this is hurting me. And within minutes, somehow, through a sequence of moves so practiced, it happens almost automatically, they find themselves comforting you, managing your reaction to their pain, apologizing for the way they brought it up. The original issue evaporates, and they're left holding both the original wound and the new guilt. They did it again. They made it worse by saying something. Their silence had been their armor, and they forgot to wear it. Here's what's happening beneath the surface of all of this, and this is the part that actually determines whether an empath stays or goes. Each of these moments is a data point, and empaths, whether they realize it or not, are running a continuous unconscious analysis of those data points. Not because they're calculating or strategic, because their nervous system is doing what nervous systems do, learning whether a place is safe, learning whether the cost of being real here is one they can afford. And at a certain point, not after one incident, not after two, but after enough, the data resolves into a conclusion. This place is not safe for me. That is the beginning of the disappearance, not the end of it. What nobody warns you about is this. The behaviors that most reliably drive an empath away are not the ones that look cruel from the outside. They are the ones that look completely normal. They are the ones that, if the empath ever tried to explain them to someone else, would be met with a blank stare or a gentle suggestion that maybe they're being a little too sensitive. This is by far the most disorienting part of the experience, not the harm itself, but the inability to make the harm legible. When you can't point to anything that looks obviously wrong, you start to wonder if something is wrong with you instead. And that self-doubt, that slow erosion of trust in your own perception is not a side effect of the dynamic. For certain people, it is the dynamic. It is the entire mechanism. So let's name the behaviors clearly, not to assign blame, but because clarity is the only thing that breaks the cycle for everyone involved. The first behavior is what psychologists call emotional outsourcing, though most people who do it have no idea they're doing it at all. It looks like this. Whenever the emotional temperature of an interaction rises, whenever something real and uncomfortable enters the room, you instinctively hand the weight of it to the empath. You become quieter or moodier, or you sigh in a way that shifts the entire atmosphere. And the empath, because of how their nervous system is wired, cannot not respond to that shift. They feel your discomfort as if it were inside their own body, so they move toward you. They soften. They ask what's wrong. They manage the emotional climate of the room so that you don't have to. And the moment they do that, the original tension, the thing they were trying to bring to your attention, or the discomfort they were sitting in, disappears, because now they're too busy tending to yours. You may experience this as them being naturally caring, and they are. But what's also happening is that their emotional needs are consistently being displaced by yours, and neither of you has named it. And the pattern repeats until the empath begins to feel that their inner world is a burden they are only permitted to carry alone. The second behavior is more subtle and arguably more damaging: conditional presence. This is the pattern where your warmth, your attention, your affection, the version of you that makes the empath feel safe, is reliably available only when things are easy. When they're happy, fun, low maintenance, and asking nothing difficult of you, you're wonderful, you're attentive, you're the person they fell in love with or chose as a friend or trusted as a family member. But the moment they bring something heavy, a need, a hurt, a boundary, a truth, the warmth recedes, not dramatically, not with cruelty. It simply cools. And the empath notices. They notice every time because they are wired to track exactly this kind of fluctuation. What they learn gradually and then all at once is that your care is not unconditional. It is a reward for being easy. And the moment they understand that, something changes permanently in how they see you, not with anger, but with a grief that is much harder to recover from. The third behavior is one that almost no one talks about, and it may be the most insidious of all, the habit of rewriting history in small increments. It doesn't announce itself as gaslighting, which is a word so overused it has started to lose its edges. It looks much quieter than that. It looks like I never said that. That's not how it happened. You always misremember things when you're upset. Each individual instance seems small enough to argue about, and arguing about it never leads anywhere because you seem so certain, and they start to wonder if their memory is simply less reliable than they thought. But what is actually happening is that their reality is being edited. Their record of events is being quietly revised. And for someone whose greatest gift is the accuracy of their perception, someone who has built their entire way of relating to the world on the belief that what they feel and observe is real, this is not a small wound. It is an attack on the very instrument they use to navigate life. After enough of these moments, they stop trusting what they perceived. They stop trusting themselves. And when a person stops trusting themselves, they have two choices: collapse inward or cut the source. Empaths, once they find the clarity, almost always choose the latter. Now, here is the contrast that most people need to sit with, because it is uncomfortable and it is true. Many of the people who enact these patterns are not malicious. They are not scheming. They are, in most cases, people who are themselves carrying unprocessed wounds. People who learned early that vulnerability was dangerous, that emotional needs were burdens, that the way to stay safe was to keep the surface smooth and never let anyone see what was actually happening underneath. That history is real. It deserves compassion. But here is what compassion does not mean. An empath is obligated to absorb the consequences of your unprocessed pain indefinitely. Those two things, understanding why someone behaves the way they do and accepting that behavior as a permanent condition of the relationship, are not the same thing. Empaths often confuse them. For a long time, their understanding functions as a kind of unconscious permission. I know why you are this way, so I will keep absorbing it. But understanding is not the same as consent, and the day they recognize that distinction is often the day the decision quietly gets made. There is also something specific that happens inside an empath during this period that is rarely described accurately. From the outside, they look like they're managing. They're still showing up, still engaged, still warm enough that nothing seems wrong. But inside, they have begun a process that can only be described as a kind of interior withdrawal. They stop bringing you their full self, not out of spite, out of protection. They bring you the version of themselves that won't get hurt here. They stop sharing the things that matter most, the creative idea they were excited about, the fear they haven't said out loud to anyone, the moment of joy so private and specific that sharing it would require real trust. Those things get quietly rerouted. They go into a part of themselves that is no longer accessible to you, and the relationship continues, often for a surprisingly long time, in this partial state, where proximity is maintained but intimacy is already gone. This is the part that causes. It's the shock later. When the empath finally leaves, or finally creates distance so definitive, it cannot be ignored. The people around them are often stunned. But everything seemed fine. We were just together last week and they seemed happy. There were no signs. There were signs. There were dozens of signs. But they were interior signs, and no one was reading the interior, because by the time an empathy stops confiding in you, they have already made the decision. What comes next is not a decision. It is an execution. There is a stage that comes after the interior withdrawal that almost no one talks about because it doesn't look like anything from the outside. The empath is still there. They still answer your calls. They still sit across from you at dinner and ask about your day. But something has fundamentally reorganized inside them, and if you knew what to look for, you would see it immediately. Their eyes don't hold yours the same way. Their laugh comes a half second later than it used to. The stories they tell you are the safe ones, surface level, low risk, requiring nothing from either of you. They have become, without announcing it, a careful version of themselves. And careful is the opposite of close. What's happening in this stage is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is something far more precise. It is an empath learning in real time how to grieve a relationship while still being physically present in it. Psychologists sometimes call this ambiguous loss, the particular anguish of mourning something that hasn't technically ended, mourning a person who is still standing right in front of you. For empaths, this experience is amplified by the very sensitivity that defined the relationship in the first place. They don't just feel the loss in their mind, they feel it in their body, continuously every time they're in your presence, and the connection they remember is nowhere to be found. Every conversation that stays shallow when it used to go deep, every moment of conflict that gets smoothed over instead of resolved, every time they start to say something real and then stop, redirect, and ask you about your week instead. They feel all of it. They are grieving in real time, and they are doing it silently, and they are doing it alone, and they are doing it while sitting right next to you. This is the cruelest part of the empath's experience, not the original wounds, but this stage, the stage where they already know how the story ends, and they're still in the middle of it, and they cannot yet leave for any number of reasons. Maybe they've built a life with you. Maybe they still love you, because empaths are capable of loving someone and knowing simultaneously that the relationship is no longer safe for them. And these two truths do not cancel each other out. They coexist in a tension that is almost unbearable. Maybe they're waiting for evidence that they're wrong. Maybe they're hoping that the person they first knew, the version of you that made them feel seen before the pattern set in, will reappear and make all of this retrospectively untrue. That hope is not weakness. It is, in fact, one of the most human things about empaths, the persistence of their belief in people's capacity to change. But it is also the thing that extends their suffering far beyond what it needs to be. Because they are extraordinarily good at imagining the best version of a person, and sometimes in a long relationship, that imagined best version is what they're actually in love with, rather than the person who is currently standing in front of them. Distinguishing between those two things, the person's potential and the person's pattern, is one of the hardest cognitive tasks any of us face in relationships. For empaths, it is harder still because their ability to feel into someone else's depth makes the potential feel very, very real. Here is where the script has to shift, because this is the point where diagnosis without direction becomes its own kind of cruelty. So let's talk about what actually changes the outcome, because the disappearance is not always inevitable. There is a window, and it is smaller than most people realize, and it closes faster than anyone expects, but it exists. And what determines whether that window stays open or shuts permanently comes down to one thing and one thing only: repair, not apology, repair. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them is everything. An apology is a statement, "I'm sorry I hurt you." It is words directed at the past. It requires nothing to change going forward, which is why empaths have often received dozens of apologies from the same person for the same behavior, and found that each subsequent apology lands with slightly less weight than the one before. Not because they're unforgiving. Empaths are extraordinarily forgiving, but because they are tracking behavior over time, and their nervous system is smarter than their hope. When the behavior doesn't change, the apology eventually registers not as remorse, but as a reset button. a way to return to zero without doing the actual work of changing the trajectory. Repair is different. Repair is behavioral. It is sustained. It is what happens when someone not only acknowledges the wound, but changes the pattern that created it. It looks like noticing when you're emotionally outsourcing and consciously choosing to hold your own discomfort instead of shifting it. It looks like when they tell you something hurt, your first response is curiosity rather than defense. That's not what I meant. But tell me more about how that landed. It looks like consistency between who you are when things are easy and who you are when things are hard. Because that gap between your easy day self and your hard day self is exactly where empaths take their measurements. It is where the data is collected. And sustained repair closes that gap in a way that no single conversation, however honest or emotional, ever can. Now, here is something important to understand about the way empaths respond to genuine repair, because it surprises most people. When real change begins, when the pattern actually shifts, the empath does not immediately soften. They become, if anything, more watchful. This is not stubbornness. This is intelligence. Their nervous system has been conditioned by the previous pattern, and it needs more evidence than a single incident to update its conclusion. This is how trust actually works, not as a light switch, but as a slow accumulation of contradictory evidence. Each interaction that goes differently than it used to is a data point in the opposite direction. Each moment of genuine repair adds to a counter record. And over time, if the change is real and sustained, the counter record becomes strong enough to revise the conclusion the nervous system had drawn. The shoulders don't tighten when the phone lights up. The stomach doesn't drop at a change in tone. The careful version begins gradually to step back. The full self begins tentatively to return. But, and this is the part that requires honest reckoning, if the repair doesn't come, or if it comes and then quietly dissolves back into the old pattern after a few weeks, the window closes. Not with drama, not with a declaration. The empath simply stops monitoring for change. They stop watching for evidence that things might be different, and when they stop watching, they have reached the final stage of the disappearance, the stage where the outcome is no longer uncertain, the S. Stage where they are simply working out the practical logistics of creating distance, in whatever form that takes, given the specifics of their life and relationship. They are no longer hoping, they are planning, and they are doing it with a clarity and a calm that can look from the outside unsettlingly like indifference, but is in reality the particular peace that comes when a person finally stops fighting against their own perception and simply allows themselves to know what they have known for a long time. That peace is not the end of grief. It is the beginning of a different kind. The grief that comes with the acceptance of a truth you spent a long time trying to disprove. But it is also, for the empath, the beginning of something else, something that the disappearance, for all its pain, makes possible, something that cannot be found on the other side of a relationship where they were never fully permitted to exist. What that something is, and what it means for everyone in this equation, on both sides, is where we go next. What the empath finds on the other side of the disappearance is not what most people expect. It is not triumph. It is not the clean cinematic freedom of someone who has finally escaped. It is quieter than that, and stranger, and in many ways more difficult, because the empath doesn't just leave a relationship when they disappear. They leave a version of themselves too, the version that spent so long contorting, shrinking, editing, and managing that it had started to feel normal. The version that had learned to experience their own emotional needs as inconveniences. The version that had become so fluent in other people's inner worlds that they had almost entirely lost the language for their own. That version doesn't dissolve the moment distance is created. It lingers. It shows up in the new silence, in the unfamiliar experience of having. No one's emotional climate to monitor in the strange discomfort of a Tuesday evening with no tension to absorb and no one to soothe. Freedom, when you have been conditioned to equate love with labor, does not feel immediately like freedom. It feels, at first, like emptiness. This is the part of the empath story that gets left out of every surface-level conversation about sensitivity and boundaries and self-protection. The disappearance is not the resolution. It is the beginning of a much harder and much more important process, the process of learning to exist fully in their own presence, of rebuilding the relationship with their own inner world that was slowly dismantled through years of having that world treated as inconvenient, excessive, or wrong, of relearning how to trust their own perception after it was questioned so many times that the questioning became an interior voice they couldn't distinguish from their own thoughts. This is not a weekend's work. It is not solved by a few weeks of journaling or a single honest conversation with a good friend. It is a reclamation that happens in layers, slowly, often non-linearly, with setbacks that look like healing and breakthroughs that arrive without warning in the middle of ordinary moments. But here's what is also true, and what matters just as much. It does happen. The reclamation happens. The empath who disappeared, who withdrew their presence so completely that the people around them barely recognized the transition until it was complete, that person finds their way back to themselves. They begin incrementally to trust what they feel again. They begin to speak from their actual experience rather than from the carefully edited version designed to avoid conflict or punishment. They begin to form connections, new and existing, where the full weight of who they are is not merely tolerated but actively welcomed. And when they experience that, when they bring their real self into a space, and the response is curiosity instead of dismissal, care instead of irritation, genuine presence instead of conditional warmth, they understand for the first time in a long time what they had been accepting. In place of that, the contrast is clarifying in a way that nothing else could be. Now let's turn to the other side of this, because if you are someone who has watched an empath disappear from your life, or who can feel it happening right now, that slow withdrawal, that careful distance settling in like weather, then this part is specifically for you, and it deserves to be said without softening. You may not have intended to cause harm. That is probably true, and it matters. And it is also not the most important thing right now. The most important thing is this: intention does not determine impact. You can wound someone without meaning to. You can systematically dismantle someone's trust in their own perception without ever consciously deciding to do so. You can outsource your emotional discomfort, deliver your conditional warmth, rewrite small moments of shared history, all without a single malicious thought. And the impact on the person absorbing all of that is identical to if you had done it deliberately. The empath's nervous system does not register your intention. It registers the pattern, and the pattern is what determines the outcome. So if the window is still open, if there is still some version of this relationship that exists, even in that careful, partial, quietly grieving state, then what is required of you is not a grand gesture. It is not a long letter or a dramatic declaration or a single conversation where everything gets said. Those things have their place, but they are not what rebuilds trust. What rebuilds trust is the next ordinary moment and the one after that. It is what you do on a random Wednesday when they say something real, and you feel the reflex to defend or dismiss or redirect, and you don't. You stay, you ask, you let their reality exist in the room without immediately trying to resize it to something more comfortable for you. It is consistency between your best day self and your worst day self. It is the slow, unglamorous, deeply necessary work of becoming someone whose care does not fluctuate based on how convenient the other person is being. That is what repair looks like, and it is the only thing that works. Here is the truth that sits underneath everything in this conversation, the one that all of it has been building toward. Empaths do not disappear because they stop loving. They disappear because they finally love themselves enough to stop accepting less than full presence in return for their own. The disappearance is not a punishment. It is not even at its core a statement about you. It is a statement about them, about what they now understand they deserve, about the kind of connection they are no longer willing to live without, about the version of themselves they have decided to protect. It is, in the most literal sense, an act of self-authorship. The moment an empath disappears, they are writing themselves back into the story as the main character rather than the supporting role they had quietly been assigned. And if you are an empath watching your own withdrawal happen, feeling yourself grow quieter, more careful, more selective about what you bring and to whom, then hear this clearly. What you are doing is not giving up. It is not failure. It is your nervous system, your instincts, your hard-won self-knowledge finally being honored rather than overridden. The question now is not whether you were right to withdraw. The question is what you are moving toward. Because disappearing, G, from the wrong places is only half the work. The other half is showing up fully in the right ones. Bringing the whole self, the perceptive, feeling, extraordinarily attuned self that was never too much, was always exactly enough, into spaces that have the capacity to hold it. That is not the end of the empath story. That is where it actually begins.